In 1066, England stood at the edge of its last great transformation. The Battle of Hastings would mark not only the fall of a king, but the final time England was conquered. From that turning point, a new era unfolded, gradual in stirrings, but destined to shape centuries. Welcome to Sleepy Journeys, the podcast designed to lull you into a peaceful slumber with soothing stories through time, places, and ideas. Whether you're winding down after a long day or simply looking for a peaceful escape, you're in the right place. My name's Jack, and I'm so happy to have you here with me. Each night on Sleepy Journeys, we set off together on gentle adventures designed to soothe your mind and ease you into rest. You'll find journeys through history, comforting fairy tales, myths and folklore, the wonders of science, fascinating inventions, inspiring famous figures, music history, and even calm explorations around the world. No matter where your curiosity takes you, there's a dreamy Sleepy Journeys show for you. Tonight, we're going to embark on a gentle journey through 1066, the year England was conquered. And just before we fully drift off, if you're enjoying Sleepy Journeys, go ahead and tap follow or subscribe on whatever platform you're joining me on. That way, you won't miss any of our upcoming sleepy adventures. And let me know in the comments where in the world you're listening from and what time it is there. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us. Now, take a deep breath and let's begin. Long before maps were inked with modern borders, before clocks ticked in glass-lit towers, the island of Britain was wrapped in a thick green hush. The year was 1066, though few who walked its roads would have known it. Time was measured not in numbers, but in sunrises and harvests, feast days and the turning of the moon. In this quiet place, tucked between gently rippling rivers and forests that whispered with wind, life followed ancient rhythms. In the early part of that year, the land was ruled by a quiet king, Edward, who had reigned for many years with a kind of stillness. The nobles around him were powerful, the church stood tall and steepled, and the countryside was dotted with small villages where smoke curled from thatched rooftops in the cool of morning. There were no grand expectations for change. To many, the world felt like it had always been this way, and would continue with its slow procession of seasons. Yet something unseen had begun to stir. Across the sea, in stone keeps and snowy halls, men of ambition were watching England, listening for the shifting of power. In Normandy, in Norway, across the Channel and through the fjords, ships were being made ready, and promises whispered in candlelight. But here, in the quiet early weeks of 1066, the land itself had no warning. The sheep grazed on the hillsides, the monks wrote softly in candlelit scriptoria, and the wind moved as it always had, brushing the tops of winter trees. This is a story often told in terms of conquest and battle, of triumph and tragedy. But tonight, we'll explore it through another lens, slower, softer, and shaped by the textures of the time. We'll walk through the long corridors of history, pausing in still moments. We'll feel the chill of early English mornings, hear the solemn tolling of church bells, and watch banners fluttering slowly in the wind. This isn't a tale of sharp edges and fierce declarations. It is a drifting journey through a year that would reshape a kingdom, gently revealing its changes, one quiet moment at a time. As you close your eyes, imagine a low mist clinging to a dew-damp field, the sun only beginning to rise behind a veil of clouds. In the distance, a village stirs, a millstone turns, a rooster calls, and soft footsteps begin to pad along a dirt road. It is into this world that our story begins, and together we will follow its winding path. Before the storm of conquest, before the sails darkened the horizon and armor gleamed beneath foreign banners, England was a land of patterns both familiar and slow. It was a tapestry of heaths and hills, of slow rivers and winding paths, and its people lived close to the land, guided by the pulse of nature and the quiet dictates of the church. There was a stillness to the rhythm of daily life, shaped by generations of continuity, where change moved like water underground, present but hidden. The fields, in January, lay in repose. Frost crusted the furrows of autumn's final tilling, and the land awaited the thaw with patient silence. Villages were modest clusters of timber and thatch, often nestled close to woodlands or along winding brooks. Paths were beaten into the soil by centuries of footfall, the steady tread of farmers, travelers, and oxen-drawn carts. In these small settlements, lives unfolded in a circle: birth, work, worship, sleep, and death, all within reach of one another. The Anglo-Saxon people lived in tightly knit communities, often under the authority of local thanes, nobles who oversaw justice and land. Their homes were simple, with earthen floors and central hearths that sent thin tendrils of smoke through hole-rimmed rooftops. Days began with the soft bleat of livestock and the rustle of cloaks drawn tight against the cold. In warmer months, these same villages would bloom with herbs and flax, the chatter of chickens, and the hum of bees. But now, in the early year, they stood in quiet watchfulness, biding time. The structure of society was carefully ordered. Beneath the king, there were earls, powerful landowners who controlled great regions. Beneath them, thanes, and beneath them, ceorls, free peasants who worked the soil and served in local feuds when needed. There were also slaves, whose days were bound by the will of their masters, though in some corners of the land, the practice was fading. Yet despite the strict hierarchy, many communities operated with a kind of informal closeness, united by custom, shared hardship, and seasonal work. The church, too, played a central role in life. Each village, if not graced with a church of stone, had a wooden chapel where services marked the passing weeks. Monasteries dotted the countryside, and monks and nuns moved through the hours with calm regularity. Their chants, prayers, and the gentle scratching of quills in scriptoria provided a kind of anchor for the wider world, a reminder of the eternal within the passing. To the common folk, the matters of kings were distant echoes. Most would never see a crown, nor feel the weight of royal decisions. What mattered more were the local fairs, the harvest blessings, and the return of spring. The forest, for many, held both mystery and necessity, a source of fuel, game, and medicine, but also stories whispered near the firelight of strange creatures, ancient curses, and wandering spirits that watched from the shadows. Trade trickled through this quiet kingdom. Markets buzzed gently on fair days, with the smells of smoked fish, wool, leather, and ale drifting through the air. Coins bearing the image of the king passed from hand to hand, but barter was still common, and many debts were measured in grain, livestock, or days of labor. It was a land content in its familiarity. Though power struggles stirred quietly among the nobility, the fabric of everyday life remained largely undisturbed. The people of England, whether ploughing in silence, reading by candlelight, or resting in the still of winter, lived in a world that felt firm beneath their feet. And as January turned to February, and the days began to lengthen once more, few could have imagined that before the year was out, the kingdom itself would be remade. At the center of England's gentle stillness stood a figure of curious calm, King Edward, later known as the Confessor. His court was cloaked in piety and introspection. He had ruled since 1042, his crown sitting lightly on his head, more the symbol of sanctity than strength. Tall and slender, with a pale face framed by a soft beard, Edward appeared more monk than monarch, and indeed, many believed his heart dwelled more in the cloister than in the royal hall. Born the son of Ethelred the Unready and Emma of Normandy, Edward had spent many years of his early life in exile, sheltered in the Norman courts after Danish invasions swept through his homeland. Those formative years left their imprint, shaping his quiet demeanor and perhaps nurturing a wistful gaze toward the continent. When he returned to England and assumed the throne, it was with a kind of reluctant duty. He fulfilled the role expected of him, but never sought dominion for dominion's sake. His rule was marked by peace within, but also by indecision, particularly in the matter of succession. As Edward aged, the matter of who would follow him became an unspoken concern, whispered in noble halls and around fire-warmed hearths. The king had no children, no direct heir to bear the crown after his passing. This absence created a subtle tremor beneath the surface of the kingdom, a tension that grew with each passing year. The court became a place of positioning, in small gestures, alliances, and glances passed during feast or prayer. The most powerful man beneath the king was Harold Godwinson, Earl of Wessex, whose family had risen to great influence. Harald was capable and pragmatic, a man of action in contrast to Edward's quiet spirituality. He was respected among nobles and feared among rivals. His sister, Edith, had been married to Edward, though their union remained childless, and their relationship seemed more ceremonial than intimate. Still, Harold's proximity to the throne placed him firmly in the minds of those who speculated about the future. Yet Edward had ties to Normandy through his mother, and there were murmurs, soft ones, like the distant echo of a bell, that he had promised the throne to Duke William of Normandy. It was said that Edward, grateful for his years in Norman exile, had looked toward William as a potential successor, someone who might protect the realm and continue his line of faith and order. No formal declaration had been made, but such promises, once whispered, were difficult to silence. Meanwhile, beyond England's green borders, others watched with quiet intensity. Harald Hardrada of Norway, a seasoned warrior and descendant of ancient kings, believed his own claim was valid by old agreements made in the tangled web of Scandinavian and Anglo-Danish politics. These foreign eyes lingered on the English crown, watching for the moment when Edward's life would end and the question of succession would rise like mist over the morning hills. For now, though, the king still lived. Each day, he walked the halls of his palace, prayed in the stone chapels of Westminster, and touched the edge of rule with a light and fading hand. His great project, the construction of Westminster Abbey, neared completion, a place of worship and reflection built in the Norman style, as if already looking toward a new age. It would be the place of his final rest, the resting place of a gentle king whose quiet life would echo long after the bells tolled for his soul. And so, as winter deepened and 1066 unfurled its first weeks, the kingdom waited, unaware that it stood on the edge of change. The air still smelled of wood smoke, the forests still whispered their secrets, and the fields still slept beneath their frost. But high above, behind the gray veil of clouds, something had begun to shift, the balance of power, the legacy of kings, and the story of England itself. In the early days of January 1066, as a pale sun drifted low behind leafless trees and the cold clung to the stone of Westminster, King Edward's life began to slip quietly toward its end. The days had grown hushed within the royal halls. Servants moved with a measured calm, courtiers whispered in corners, and candles flickered long into the afternoons, casting soft light against the carved timbers and stone. Edward lay in his chamber, surrounded by the murmured prayers of monks and the anxious silence of those closest to him. His body, long, slender, and weary, rested beneath heavy woven blankets, though no warmth could reach the chill within his bones. His breaths came slow, shallow, and rhythmic, each one a gentle toll of time. The great king who had once steadied England through decades of rule now found himself balanced delicately between this world and the next. The bed on which he lay was draped in tapestries and furs, the scent of incense curling faintly through the air. Around him stood members of his household, Queen Edith, the ever-watchful wife who had remained faithful beside him despite their distant marriage, Harold Godwinson, whose eyes betrayed a mind calculating out of duty, and beyond them, the Witan, the King's Council, formed of bishops, nobles, and earls, who now watched and waited as time narrowed. The Witanagemote, or Witan for short, was not merely ceremonial. It was an ancient body, one that held the right to advise and, in critical moments, determine who might next wear the crown. And now, as Edward's moments dwindled, the weight of that responsibility rested heavily upon them. Tradition held firm, the king's word mattered, but so did the consensus of the realm's most powerful minds. It is said that in his final hours, Edward opened his eyes and, with a weakened voice, offered blessings for England's future. Accounts vary. Some said he named Harald as his chosen successor, placing the realm into his capable hands. Others, later chroniclers, suggested that the promise made long ago to Duke William still lingered, unspoken but potent. The truth of that moment lies hidden behind the veils of time, but in that quiet room, a decision began to take shape. Outside, in the abbey that Edward had built with pious determination, preparations were quietly underway. Westminster Abbey, a great stone edifice shaped in the Norman style, stood as both a monument to his faith and the final chapter of his life. Within days, it would host his burial and, in its very shadow, the coronation of the man who would try to hold the kingdom steady in the storm to come. On January 5th, as twilight descended once more over the rooftops and smoke curled gently from chimneys across the city, King Edward the Confessor exhaled his last breath. The moment was quiet, sacred, and unaccompanied by spectacle. The king had passed, leaving behind no heir of his blood, but a realm full of questions, loyalties, and careful eyes turned toward the crown. The bells of Westminster tolled slow and deep, echoing across the rooftops of London and the surrounding fields. Their sound moved like ripples across the land, carried by cold air and wind, reaching even the distant villages where few knew the workings of courtly succession. To most, it was simply the passing of a king, a solemn moment, respected and observed. But to those gathered near the deathbed, it marked the beginning of something else entirely. The Witan would meet again, swiftly and with purpose. The kingdom could not long remain leaderless, for the air was full of tensions only barely concealed. As Edward was laid to rest, the question hung like morning mist over the land. Who would now bear the weight of the crown, and what would become of England? In the hours following King Edward's death, as the embers of candlelight still flickered in Westminster's stone corridors, and the scent of incense hung faintly in the air, the Witan convened with quiet urgency. The moment was solemn, wrapped in silence and ritual, but it also carried with it the weight of continuity. The realm required a king, and it could not drift long without guidance. Winter still held the land in its grip, and though the fields slept beneath frost, decisions within stone walls moved with quiet speed. Harold Godwinson, Earl of Wessex, was a man both familiar and formidable. He had long served as Edward's chief advisor, had led campaigns against rebellion, and watched the coasts for foreign sails. His lineage, though not royal, was noble and far-reaching, and his family held broad influence across the realm. Unlike Edward, whose strength lay in piety, Harold was a man shaped by action, by counsel, diplomacy, and the tempered steel of responsibility. To many among the Witan, his leadership felt natural, a continuation of order in uncertain times. In the council chamber, cloaked in woven hangings and warmed by a low-burning fire, the Witan discussed Harold's claim with deliberate calm. There were those who raised questions, but few voiced opposition. He was English, respected and present, a figure they could place their trust in, even as foreign interests stirred beyond the sea. Though there were whispers of promises made to Duke William, or alliances once considered with Scandinavia, those voices remained distant for now, removed by water and winter. Harold accepted the decision of the Witan with solemnity, acknowledging the trust placed upon him. The moment of succession passed without fanfare. There were no trumpets or grand proclamations. Instead, there was a shared understanding among the gathered nobles that a thread had been tied from the last breath of one king to the steady hands of the next. On January 6th, the very next day, Harold was crowned King of England in Westminster Abbey. The great church, still echoing with the sorrow of Edward's funeral, now held a second, quieter ceremony. Beneath its high arches and stained glass windows, in the presence of bishops and noblemen, the crown of England was placed upon Harold's head. The act was deliberate and steeped in tradition, an affirmation of continuity meant to reassure a nation that the wheel of governance still turned. The coronation was simple by the standards of later ages, but rich in symbolism. The anointing of Harold was conducted by Ealdred, the Archbishop of York, in part because the Archbishop of Canterbury, Stigand, had a contested legitimacy. Still, the rite proceeded without interruption. Cloaked in robes and bearing the symbols of office, Harold stood quietly as chants rose to the ceiling and light filtered through winter clouds. Outside the abbey, London stirred with muted curiosity. Word of the coronation spread quickly through the streets and marketplaces, and though not all fully understood the implications, most received the news with a kind of reserved approval. Harold was known, and in uncertain times, familiarity could feel like safety. But even as the crown rested on his head, Harold would have known that peace would not last. Across the Channel, in Norman halls built of thick stone and warm with the fire of ambition, Duke William would soon learn of Edward's death and Harold's swift coronation. And far to the north, where snow covered the fjords and icy waters lapped against the shore, another claimant, Harald Hardrada, would consider this a breach of old agreements and begin to stir. For now, though, England had a king once more. And for a brief span of winter weeks, the land remained still. The frost did not crackle beneath the coming of horses, nor did sails yet darken the coastline. But they would. The season of calm had narrowed, and far beyond the hedgerows and hills, the march of history had already begun to wake. Across the narrowing channel, where the winds turned colder and the tides ran strong, the Duchy of Normandy stirred in a way that differed from England's quiet morning. In its stone-walled keeps and sun-dappled monasteries, news of Edward the Confessor's death arrived as a signal, a summons to purpose. Duke William, Lord of Normandy and distant cousin to the departed king, received the tidings with measured stillness, yet his mind moved swiftly beneath that calm exterior. William, born of Robert the Magnificent and a woman named Hardrada, had risen through hardship and struggle to forge a powerful and respected domain. His rule was carved through years of conflict, loyalty, and shrewd control. Normandy, under his leadership, had grown prosperous and strong, a land of disciplined cavalry, fortified towns, and a church loyal to its duke. In William, strength and patience met in equal measure. When the messengers arrived, their feet weary from travel and their cloaks heavy with salt air, they brought more than simple news. They carried the truth that Harold Godwinson had taken the crown, swiftly, without consultation, and in seeming defiance of a sacred promise. For William believed, as did many in his court, that Edward had once offered him the throne of England. The promise had been made, it was said, during Edward's exile, or perhaps reaffirmed later, through envoys or quiet gestures of diplomacy. Whatever its form, William believed it binding. To the Duke, Harold's coronation was more than a political challenge. It was a personal betrayal. Harold had, on a previous journey, sworn an oath to William, reportedly while resting his hands upon holy relics, that he would support the Norman claim to the throne upon Edward's death. Whether the oath was coerced, misunderstood, or misrepresented would later become a matter of fierce debate. But to William, the meaning was clear. Harold's kingship was illegitimate, and the throne of England had been wrongfully seized. Yet William was not a man to act in haste. Preparations began slowly, with care and intent. He summoned his advisors, consulted with clergy, and sought the blessing of the Pope, hoping to frame his cause as righteous and divinely supported. Messengers were dispatched to allies across Normandy and beyond, calling lords and vassals to gather arms and ships in solemn purpose. In the harbor towns, sails were stitched and sharpened blades placed in racks. Carpenters shaped new vessels with practiced hands, and blacksmiths worked by torchlight to prepare armor and horseshoes. The sound of preparation, though subdued, spread like a drumbeat through the countryside. And yet, through it all, there was no spectacle. William's resolve was quiet, his ambition veiled beneath the careful routine of readiness. He waited, watched the tides, and planned his crossing with a patient eye. Norman monasteries, meanwhile, became sites of both prayer and planning. Monks illuminated manuscripts with careful strokes, even as their abbots whispered with nobles in cloistered gardens. The church's support would be vital, not merely for spiritual justification, but to calm the hearts of those who might fear a foreign war. When at last the papal banner was secured, William's cause took on a mantle of holy approval. To those around him, the path forward now felt inevitable. Evening by evening, the Duke would walk the halls of his stone strongholds, cloaked in silence and firelight, his thoughts drifting across the water to the kingdom he believed was rightfully his. He imagined its fields, its churches, its throne. Yet he did not dream idly. Each thought turned to action, each vision translated into order and supply. William was drawn to England by conviction, a quiet certainty that the realm belonged under his hand and that its future depended on his crossing. Far to the north, where the fjords stretched deep into the stone spine of the earth and snow capped the jagged peaks like a hush over mountains, another figure stood quietly on the edge of legend. Harald Hardrada, King of Norway, was a man of long memory and longer ambition. His hands bore the weight of many years, and his shoulders had known both exile and triumph. Where William was methodical and legalistic, Harold moved with the patience of winter, slow, immense, and inevitable. His story began long before 1066. As a young man, he had fought at the Battle of Stiklestad, fleeing afterward to the court of Kievan Rus. From there, he journeyed further still, becoming a warrior in the service of the Byzantine emperors. His years in Constantinople shaped him with discipline and command, and when he returned to Norway to claim the crown, it was with the aura of one who had seen the world and returned seasoned by fire and stone. By the time the year of Edward's death arrived, Harold was already a king, well-established and formidable. Yet the claim he held to the throne of England was born of older accords, agreements formed decades earlier when King Nut ruled over a North Sea empire, binding together England, Denmark, and Norway. Those threads had frayed over time, but in Harold's mind, they had not snapped. He believed, with the clarity of his era, that a promise unkept remained a bond unbroken. And so, when the tidings reached his court that Edward was dead and Harold Godwinson had crowned himself king, Harold listened, measured the wind, and began to plan. His thoughts turned to Tostig Godwinson, Harold's exiled brother, who had taken refuge in Flanders and now roamed in search of support. Tostig, bitter from his banishment and eager for revenge, offered his allegiance to Harold, promising that the English crown could be claimed with force and with the support of discontented factions within. Together, they began to weave their intentions into action. Ships were prepared in Norwegian harbors, long and sleek, their dragon heads carved with ancient purpose. Warriors were summoned, men of axe and shield, many of whom had known the road and were not strangers to distant shores. These were chosen fighters, hardened by years of coastal campaigns and internal strife. Unlike William, who sought legitimacy through the church and foreign allies, Harold's claim bore the weight of personal resolve and the thunder of the Old North. He would come, he said, to fulfill a destiny whispered by the past. His mind moved like the ice-melt rivers in spring, slowly at first, then with increasing momentum. The sails were hoisted as summer approached, catching winds that bore the scent of pine and salt. The movement was patient, deliberate, and coordinated. As oarsmen trained and provisions were loaded, Harald stood beneath the cloudy Norwegian sky, his fur-lined cloak stirring softly in the breeze, his thoughts fixed on the green fields of England. He did not underestimate his foe. Harold Godwinson was known as a capable leader. But to Harald, the English throne was a gift deferred, waiting now to be claimed with steel and memory. The quiet before his departure held a peculiar stillness. It was the pause before footsteps echo in a long hall, the hush before the storm reaches land. In the far north, fjords echoed only with the calls of seabirds and the lap of water against wood. But soon, the rhythm of rowing would carry him toward the heart of England, and history would shift beneath his boots. As the summer of 1066 began to fade into autumn, the skies over England softened with the golden hush of late warmth, and the trees along the rivers turned their leaves with quiet deliberation. In the north, the rhythms of village life continued with cautious optimism. Harvest neared completion, and the people of Yorkshire, like much of England, remained unaware of what approached from over the sea. The storms of war were coming, like a tide that first whispers before it rises. It was in early September that Harald Hardrada's fleet finally cut across the waters and reached the shores of northern England. The ships glided like shadows over the sea, their long hulls cleaving the surf with calm precision. The dragon-headed prows, carved with ancient symbols of protection and fate, touched the English coast near the River Ouse. With them came hundreds of seasoned warriors, veterans of many campaigns, clad in mail, bearing axes, and speaking in the deep tones of the Norse tongue. At Harold's side rode Tostig Godwinson, the exiled brother of King Harald. Together, they landed near Recall and began to move inland, their banners silent but unmistakable. Their aim was the city of York, to bring it under their control and strengthen their foothold in the region. They marched slowly, because each step marked their growing presence in the north, sending a message before the clash of swords could speak more loudly. On September 20th, they met their first challenge at the Battle of Fulford. The Earls Edwin of Mercia and Morcar of Northumbria, young but determined, led the English resistance. They had raised a force of local men, stout-hearted, but fewer in number and less battle-worn than the approaching host. The fields outside Fulford, damp with recent rain and speckled with low brush, became the setting for a confrontation that, though brief, marked a decisive shift. The battle unfolded under an overcast sky, where the sun broke only briefly between heavy clouds. The English forces fought with courage, forming ranks and rallying behind their earls. Yet the weight of Norse experience and the sheer discipline of Harold's formations pressed them back. The shield walls shuddered, then splintered, and the tide of the battle turned. Edwin and Morcar were forced to retreat, and the road to York lay open. Despite their victory, Harold and Tostig accepted the surrender of York and awaited hostages, planning to solidify their hold without unnecessary destruction. They agreed to meet the citizens again at a place called Stamford Bridge in a few days' time. There, final terms would be confirmed. It was a decision that spoke to the measured confidence of the Norse king. The threat had not yet stirred from the south, and the northern gates of England seemed ready to open with little resistance. Yet while Harold rested near Recall and watched the wind move over the flat land of the Yorkshire countryside, news was already moving faster than his army had. A rider had been dispatched to Harold Godwinson, who was still in the south, watching for William of Normandy. Upon hearing of the invasion in the north, Harold acted with astonishing speed. His army, hardened from coastal defenses, turned and began to march, nearly 200 miles in less than 2 weeks, along ancient Roman roads and forest-shadowed paths, through hills and valleys, toward the waiting storm. The English countryside stood between two great kings. One, seasoned by foreign wars, stood victorious in the north. The other, crowned by the Witan and tested by duty, now moved swiftly to reclaim what had been breached. The meeting at Stamford Bridge was approaching, as the quiet drawing together of two threads, woven toward a moment that neither force could avoid. The morning of September 25th, 1066, rose gently over the English landscape, bathing the fields near Stamford Bridge in soft light. Mist clung to the low grasses, and the River Derwent flowed in its quiet course through the valley. Birds stirred in the hedgerows, and smoke rose lazily from village chimneys. To the Norsemen encamped nearby, it was to be a day of diplomatic calm, the formal reception of hostages, and the final arrangement of terms after their triumph at Fulford. But the peace of that morning was a fragile veil, one about to be drawn aside. Unbeknownst to Harold Hardrada and his men, Harold Godwinson and his army had arrived. They had marched relentlessly from the south, covering the long road with determined speed, their footsteps beating a steady rhythm across woodlands and downs. Their arrival was heralded with the sudden, silent gathering of an English force cresting the hills. As the mist lifted, the sight of spears and banners greeted the Norwegians with a looming, silent certainty. Many of the Norsemen, expecting no conflict that day, had left behind pieces of their armor at their ships near Recall. They had dressed lightly, without the full readiness of battle. Some lounged near the riverbanks, others stood in casual conversation near the bridge, watching the countryside. When they realized what approached, there was no panic, only a sharp pivot from rest to readiness. Harold Hardrada, experienced as he was, moved quickly to gather his forces, calling men to arms with firm commands and unwavering clarity. What followed was a battle unlike the one at Fulford, more chaotic in its beginnings, yet more decisive in its conclusion. The bridge itself became an early focal point. Legend tells of a single Norse warrior holding the narrow crossing alone, wielding a great axe and cutting down English soldiers one by one, delaying their advance. Only by stealth and maneuver, creeping beneath the bridge to strike from below, was the path cleared. The details may have blurred with time, but the image remains vivid. One man standing against many, buying moments that shaped the course of hours. Once across, Harold's forces met the full might of the Norse army in the open fields. The clash was fierce, the sound of metal on shield echoing across the valley. Yet despite their bravery, the Norse were outnumbered and unprepared. The sun climbed higher, illuminating the struggle below. Harald Hardrada, ever at the front, fought with the valor of old sagas. He wielded his sword with a giant's strength until, in the thick of the fray, an arrow struck him down. The force that had seemed unstoppable now wavered, and the thunder of the north began to falter. Tostig, too, fell in battle, defiant until the end. With the deaths of their leaders and their ranks thinning beneath the relentless press of English arms, the Norwegians began to break. Some fled toward the ships, others stood to the last. When the fighting ended, the field was scattered with the silence that follows fierce noise. The English had won, though the price had been steep. The field near Stamford Bridge, once intended for parley, had become the site of a king's final triumph. Harold, weary and shadowed by what he had witnessed, allowed the survivors to depart. Of the hundreds of ships that had carried the Norwegians, only a few dozen were needed to bear home the wounded and the broken. Harold Hardrada's campaign had ended with stillness. His saga had reached its final stanza, written in blood and soil. Yet even as Harold stood victorious, there was no time to rest. Only days later, a new message would arrive from the south. The winds had turned. William of Normandy had crossed the Channel. A second storm had landed, even before the first had cleared. While the echoes of battle lingered in the north, the winds along England's southern coast began to carry with them the quiet weight of new arrivals. For weeks, Duke William of Normandy had waited, his fleet held by persistent winds that pushed steadily from the north. The weather offered no room for passage, and so the ships remained in harbor, their sails furled and their soldiers waiting. Then, as September neared its close, the skies began to shift. On the 27th day of the month, the wind turned, and with it came movement. Under a silver-tinged sky, William's fleet slipped from the Norman shore in calm procession. Around 700 vessels made the crossing, some bearing horses, others filled with men and supplies. The Channel, often restless, held still. Waters rolled gently beneath them, carrying the Norman ambitions across a narrow sea toward a distant land they had long envisioned but never touched. At Pevensey, the coast opened in a low curve, its shingle beaches and quiet hills presenting no resistance. The Normans landed without interruption. The ships grounded themselves along the shore with slow purpose, and soldiers disembarked in deliberate silence. Horses were guided down gangplanks, carts were unloaded, and rows of tents began to rise along the soft, sea-washed ground. The stone ruins of a Roman fort overlooked the scene, an ancient sentinel now bearing witness to a new arrival. Pevensey had been chosen carefully. The surrounding landscape offered natural protection and space for establishing a foothold. From there, William's forces moved inland to Hastings, where they constructed a timbered fort marked by a ring of freshly dug ditches and wooden palisades. The camp took shape in measured strokes, a place intended for permanence, its walls drawn carefully across the rising land. Food and resources were gathered from the countryside. In some places, villagers offered goods in uneasy exchange, while others kept to their homes, watching the newcomers from a distance. There was no immediate violence, only the careful expansion of presence. Soldiers patrolled in pairs, tools rang against earth and wood, and cooking fires sent up ribbons of smoke as the day waned. William passed often through the encampment. He studied the layout of tents, inspected the stored provisions, and paused often to watch the inland hills. Each quiet choice he made carried a layer of foresight. His landing was complete, but his thoughts remained in motion. The army behind him was in place, and the ground beneath his boots no longer felt foreign. Back in London, Harold Godwinson received the message with a sense of urgency shaped by fatigue. His men had only just returned from the long march north and the fierce clash at Stamford Bridge. Still, he summoned them again. The roads to the south stretched out before them, lined with hedgerows and curling under the weight of early autumn. Once more, the army began to move, bearing with it the burden of duty and the memory of battles already fought. The wind swept gently across the Sussex hills, rustling leaves and bending grasses. Between those hills and the sea, the two paths now approached one another, each led by a man who believed his place was ahead. The land, still quiet, would soon be called to witness the turning of a kingdom's fate. The days that followed William's landing unfolded beneath soft skies, with a haze that clung gently to the Sussex fields. The Norman camp near Hastings became a place of quiet preparation. There was no sense of haste, only the steady continuation of tasks already set in motion. Men repaired gear, tended horses, and drilled with disciplined patience. Around them, the early October air moved gently, brushing against tent cloth and stirring the grasses that bordered the encampment. William kept the camp focused. His commanders, experienced knights and trusted vassals, saw to the discipline of the army. Each man had his part, and each part moved in rhythm with the whole. Horses were exercised on the open ground. Blacksmiths worked under canvas awnings, forging iron and mending armor. Supplies flowed steadily from the coast, carried in wagons and sorted beneath canvas shelters. The camp settled into its pattern without disruption, and the army grew more grounded with each passing day. Scouts moved along the roads, watching for signs of movement from the north. They spoke to locals when they could, listened more often than they asked, and returned with word that the king's army had begun to move. Harold was on his way, having left London and begun the long march south. His men were experienced, though tired. Still, they were coming, and William made certain his own forces would be ready when the meeting arrived. At the same time, Harold pressed forward with steady urgency. His army had only recently laid down arms after the confrontation at Stamford Bridge. They had marched north in haste, fought with all the strength they could summon, and now were summoned again. Despite the toll of exhaustion, they did not falter. The king rode at the front, flanked by his housecarls, and behind him came the thanes and levied men from the southern shires. Their feet beat a rhythm upon the dry roads, moving through woods, villages, and open fields. As the two forces drew closer, the the land between them took on a feeling of stillness. Villagers along the paths fell quiet. Doors were closed more firmly, and livestock were brought close to shelter. The people of Sussex had heard whispers of battle, though they knew little of how or where it might unfold. To them, it was as if the very earth had paused, caught between breath and consequence. William, having studied the inland terrain, chose his ground with care. He settled his army near a small rise outside the town of Hastings, a wooded slope that offered a natural vantage, flanked by forested ridges and open space for cavalry maneuver. The position gave him confidence in his placement. He arranged his troops in layers, archers in front, infantry behind them, and cavalry waiting on the wings. Harold, arriving from the north, found the Norman position already in place. He gathered his forces on a nearby ridge, forming a long line of tightly packed warriors, shield by shield, housecarl by housecarl. Their formation was designed to hold, their wall of wood and iron joined together by familiarity and strength. They took their places beneath a gray sky, where the light filtered softly through the thinning leaves of the trees behind them. As the light waned on the 13th of October, both armies lay in quiet readiness. Along the gentle slopes, campfires shimmered like small stars fallen to earth, their smoke curling into the cooling air. Soldiers moved with care, some tending their equipment, others sitting in thoughtful stillness. Bread was shared, murmured prayers rose into the dusk, and swords were checked one last time beneath the canopy of twilight. Around the edges of each camp, sentries walked slow circuits, their footsteps softened by dry grass and earth worn smooth by years of quiet seasons. The sky above held its soft veil of evening cloud, drifting slowly across the fading blue. Beneath it, thousands lay in the hush before battle, resting in uneven sleep beneath cloaks and open air. Across the fields, the land held its breath. Trees stood motionless at the edges of the ridges, and the birds had long since returned to their nests. Along the darkened edges of each camp, men whispered of home, of duty, of what morning might bring. That night passed without signal or sound to disturb it. In the silence between two forces, time moved gently forward. Whatever the outcome of the next day, those who waited beneath the stars had already stepped into a place from which the world would look different. The winds moved softly over the hills, and the earth beneath them remained still, waiting. Morning broke slowly over the fields near Hastings, light seeping through a pale sky veiled in drifting mist. The air was cool and still, the kind of quiet that settles before something irreversible takes shape. Along the ridge now known as Senlac Hill, Harold's army began to stir. The men rose from rough sleep, stretched aching limbs, and prepared their gear. The fires burned low, their embers warm beneath the ash. Housecarls tightened their belts, checked their axes, and stood beside the thanes and levied farmers who had answered their king's call. Far across the field, the Norman camp moved in equal rhythm. Horses were saddled, banners unfurled, and helmets were drawn down over weary brows. William mounted his horse as the first shafts of light touched the tops of the trees, his gaze set toward the ridgeline where Harold's army had taken position. There was no call for words. Each man understood the shape of the day. The field stretched between them, edged by woods, and folding gently with the land's quiet contours. Harold had chosen his ground with care. His army stood shoulder to shoulder along the ridge, forming a long, dense wall of shields. The hill gave them elevation, and the tightness of their formation lent strength. It was a formation meant to withstand. The Englishmen waited in silence, unmoving, a quiet barricade of oak and steel beneath the morning haze. William, below, arranged his forces with calm precision. His archers stood at the front, crossbows and bows strung tight. Behind them, infantry bore spears and short swords. And on the flanks, held slightly apart, stood the Norman cavalry, mailed knights upon trained horses, their eyes on the hill above. The army stood in three parts, each echoing the others, each awaiting the signal. The first movement came with little sound. Arrows arced into the morning air, their tips glinting faintly as they rose and fell. But the English line, shield-bound and firm, absorbed the volleys. Few fell. When the infantry advanced next, climbing the slope in steady lines, they met a wall that would not bend. Axes and spears clashed, but the hill remained held. William called forth his cavalry, and with a thunder of hooves, they surged forward. Yet the line held again. The Norman knights found no soft point, no weakness, only the steady weight of resistance. The hours passed. The sun climbed higher. The field became thick with noise, steel against shield, cries of men, the heavy breath of battle drawn in waves. Still, the ridge remained in English hands. Again and again, Norman forces struck the line, and each time they were pushed back down the slope. The men on the hill stood rooted, trained to wait, shaped by the rhythm of holding ground. At one point, William's forces wavered. A rumor spread through the ranks that the Duke had fallen. Panic stirred briefly, and retreat threatened. But William lifted his helmet, showed his face, and rallied his men. He rode among them calmly, reminding them of the purpose they had carried across the sea. Order returned, and the battle resumed. Later, William tried a different tactic. He ordered his cavalry to feign retreat, turning suddenly mid-charge to simulate disorder. Some among the English, eager to press an advantage, broke formation and gave chase. The gap this opened was small, but William saw it. He moved quickly. His knights turned, surrounded the separated men, and struck. The line above, though still firm, had begun to fray at its edges. As the day continued, this pattern repeated. The Normans pushed, fell back, turned, and attacked again. The English held fast, but with each surge, their line grew thinner. Fatigue spread like a quiet ache through the hilltop ranks. Arms grew heavy, shields cracked, and the sound of the fighting changed, less frequent, but deeper, like waves crashing more slowly upon the shore. By late afternoon, the sun tilted westward. Shadows stretched across the field. On the ridge, the banners of England still stood, but more loosely. At the center, Harold remained, his closest housecarls still beside him. They had fought from the first moment, neither advancing nor retreating, grounded on the ridge where the fate of a kingdom rested. And still, the battle had not ended. As the sun sank lower behind the wooded horizon, the battlefield softened into gold. Dust and smoke hovered gently above the field, stirred only by the breeze and the slow movement of wounded men. The rhythm of the clash had lessened. Fewer voices rose now. Fewer weapons struck. Where once there had been a continuous tide of assault and defense, there remained only scattered resistance and the dull weight of exhaustion. Harold's shield wall, so firm through the long day, had grown thin. Breaks appeared in its once solid front, in places where men had fallen and others had stepped forward too late. The housecarls, those seasoned warriors who had stood at the king's side from the beginning, continued to fight with unshaken resolve. They remained where they had sworn to stand, on the slope of Senlac Hill, where the fate of their king and of England now hung in the fading light. At the center, Harold still held his place. His banner, bearing the emblem of a fighting man, flew above him. Accounts of what happened next vary, shaped by chroniclers with differing voices and allegiances. Some spoke of an arrow that struck him from above, piercing his eye and sending him to the ground. Others described a fall in close combat, surrounded by Norman knights. However it came, his death marked a shift that could be felt across the ridge like a gust of wind through dry leaves. When word of the king's fall spread, those around him continued to fight, drawing in close, forming a ring of resistance around his body. Yet without his presence, the line had no heart left to hold it. The men began to waver. Some stayed to the end, others drifted back, and a few turned to the trees and fled into the gathering dark. The battle, which had begun in silence, drew now to a close in the same manner, with a gradual slowing, as though the field itself exhaled. William surveyed the slope as the last resistance crumbled. His face bore no triumph, only the fatigue that follows long waiting and long effort. He dismounted and walked a stretch of the field, speaking with his men, offering steadying words. Around him, the banners of Normandy stood in the dusk. The battle had ended. The day was over. The cost had been steep. Many of his own knights had fallen, and the field bore the weight of that price. The night that followed held no celebration. The wind moved gently through the trees. The fires in the Norman camp burned lower than before. Men sat quietly, some bandaging wounds, others cleaning their blades with slow, careful strokes. Among the fallen, the English dead lay in solemn stillness, their hands loosened from weapons, their shields resting now in silence. In the days that followed, William moved with care. He paused, allowing the news of Harold's death to move ahead of him. He sent messages, accepted oaths, and watched the realm respond. The English nobles debated, uncertain of their next step. The Witan, shaken by the rapid turning of events, eventually recognized the change that had taken place. By Christmas of that year, William stood within Westminster Abbey, the very place where Edward the Confessor had once knelt in prayer and where Harold had worn the crown. Now it was William's turn to be anointed, to place the crown upon his head through ceremony. The chants echoed beneath the high stone arches, and the scent of incense drifted through the cold winter air. As the crown was lowered, voices rose in acclaim. The sound startled the Norman guards, who momentarily mistook it for unrest, drawing their swords within the sacred space. Yet order was restored, and the coronation completed. William, once Duke, now stood as king, his journey across the sea and across the battlefield, brought to conclusion beneath the vaulted ceiling of a foreign land that now called him ruler. The year 1066 closed with a new order. The banners of Normandy now flew over English soil, and the language of rule began to change, slowly and quietly. Yet beyond the halls of power, the land remained as it had always been. The rivers flowed in their ancient beds, the trees bent gently in the wind, and in villages untouched by power, the people returned to their lives, planting, tending, and waiting once more for spring. Now the year draws to a close. The winds that once carried ships across the channel have softened. The battlefields have emptied, and the weight of footsteps has faded into soil. Across the fields of England, where banners once fluttered in long lines and voices rang out in urgent cries, there is now only stillness. The story of 1066, so often told in sword strokes and claims of power, begins to quiet. Far from the halls of Westminster, the land begins to return to its rhythm. In villages tucked beside riverbanks, smoke curls upward from chimneys once more. Sheep move slowly across frosted pastures. Church bells sound in the distance, marking time for morning prayers and evening rest. The farmers watch the sky for clouds that promise rain or sun. In the woods where no army marched, branches sway gently above the forest floor. Leaves turn and fall, caught in the hush of wind, and the animals stir without alarm. Nothing here remembers the crown placed upon William's brow, nor the name of Harold carried in morning songs. But the land remembers stillness. And in that stillness, the memory of a turning year settles softly, like snow that blankets the path without erasing its shape. Back on the ridgeline of Senlac Hill, where shields once locked together in defiance and war horses climbed in thunderous charge, only grass remains. It grows tall in places, scattered with wildflowers and moved by the breeze. Beneath it lie the echoes of men who stood fast for duty. The hill carries their memory in the hush that follows. Visitors may come, now and again, pausing in quiet reflection as the wind brushes their coats and the sky turns above them. William's reign would reshape England slowly. Languages mixed, customs shifted, and castles rose where wooden halls once stood. But none of that came in an instant. The world changed gently with each sunrise, each decree, each turning of the wheel. Just as it had before, and just as it always will. And as you settle into rest now, perhaps your thoughts drift across those distant hills. Imagine the river Derwent, quiet under the sky, or the coast at Pevensey, its tides coming in soft rhythm against the shore. Picture the forests of Yorkshire, or the abbey stones of Westminster, catching the golden light of an early winter afternoon. Let these images linger like the final notes of a lullaby, not sharp, but steady. Not distant, but near. Let the quiet of the past fold over you like a blanket. Let the footsteps fade, the banners lower, and the year drift into silence. What was once a time of change now becomes a memory held gently in the hands of history. Sleep well now. The journey is done. The fields are empty, the sea is calm, and the stars above England shine just as they did before the year turned. Thank you for joining me on tonight's journey. I hope it brought you a little peace, a little wonder, and a little closer to rest. Until next time. Sweet dreams.